The day my husband realized he wasn't getting a single dollar from my father's estate was the same day I watched every ounce of confidence drain from his face. I still remember the silence, not the peaceful kind. The kind that fills a room after someone's entire plan has just exploded in front of them. Jason sat across from the attorney's conference table holding paperwork in trembling hands. His face had gone completely pale. He looked down, then back up, then down again, as if reading the same sentence over and over might somehow change the outcome. "It says I have no claim," he finally whispered. The attorney adjusted his glasses. "That is correct." Jason stared. "No claim at all?" "No, but we're married." The attorney folded his hands. "The trust was established years ago. The assets were never marital property." I watched Jason's jaw tighten. The same man who had spent months acting like my father's death was a lottery ticket had just learned there would be no jackpot. And honestly, watching that moment felt better than I expected. Not because I enjoyed seeing someone suffer, but because that was the exact moment I realized I wasn't crazy. For years I had ignored little signs, little comments, little moments, things that felt wrong but were easy to explain away until they weren't. Until my father's funeral, until the inheritance, until the divorce papers, and until I discovered that my husband hadn't been grieving with me at all. He'd been calculating. My name is Emily. I'm 34 years old. And this story begins about 3 years before my father died. Back when I still believed my husband loved me. Back when I thought our marriage was solid. Back when I had absolutely no idea that Jason was quietly waiting for the day my father passed away. My father, Robert, was one of those people everyone respected. He wasn't flashy. He wasn't the kind of millionaire who drove exotic cars or wore designer suits. Most people meeting him for the first time assumed he was just another retired man who enjoyed fishing and gardening. What they didn't know was that he owned several commercial properties throughout the state. Over decades, he had built an investment company that generated more money than most people could imagine. But he never lived like a wealthy man. He always said the same thing. Money is a tool. The moment it becomes your personality, you've already lost. Growing up, I never felt rich. My parents lived comfortably but modestly. I attended public schools. I worked summer jobs. Dad insisted I earn things myself. When I graduated college, he congratulated me and handed me a toolbox. Not money, a toolbox. I laughed. "Dad, what am I supposed to do with this?" He smiled. "Build your own life." That was who he was. Jason seemed to admire him. At least that's what I believed. We met when I was 27. He was charming, funny, confident without being arrogant, or at least that's how he appeared. He worked in sales and could talk to anyone. My friends loved him. My family welcomed him immediately. Even my father seemed impressed, at first. When Jason proposed 2 years later, everyone celebrated, including Dad. He pulled me aside before the wedding. "Are you happy?" I smiled. "Very." "Good." That was it. No warnings, no concerns, nothing. If he had doubts back then, he kept them to himself. The first few years of marriage felt normal. We bought a house. We traveled occasionally. We argued about the same stupid things every couple argues about. Laundry, dishes, whose turn it was to buy groceries. Nothing seemed unusual, but looking back now, I can see the beginning. The tiny cracks. The comments that didn't register at the time. Whenever my father bought something expensive, Jason noticed. Whenever Dad mentioned a property sale, Jason remembered every detail. Whenever family finances came up, Jason paid unusually close attention. One Christmas, Dad casually mentioned selling a building downtown. Jason immediately asked how much it sold for. Dad laughed. "Enough." Jason laughed too. But he asked again. "Seriously though?" Dad simply smiled. "Enough." The conversation moved on, but I noticed Jason seemed annoyed. At the time, I thought nothing of it. Now, I think Dad noticed. Years later, I learned my father noticed far more than I ever did. One evening, about a year before he got sick, Jason and I attended a family dinner. Dad was grilling steaks. Mom was setting the table. Everything felt normal. Until Dad stepped inside to answer a phone call. The moment he left, Jason leaned toward my mother. "So who's taking over everything eventually?" My mother looked confused. "What do you mean?" "The properties. The business?" Mom shrugged. "Your father-in-law handles all that." Jason smiled. "But someday Emily will inherit it, right?" The question felt strange. My mother's smile faded slightly. "That's really none of our concern right now." Jason laughed as if he'd been joking, but I remember the awkward silence afterward. Even then something felt off. I just didn't know what. Dad returned a few minutes later. Dinner continued. Life moved on, or at least I thought it did. About 8 months later, my father received a diagnosis. Cancer. Aggressive. Advanced. The kind of diagnosis that instantly divides life into before and after. I still remember sitting in that hospital room. Mom crying. Dad remaining calm. Doctors explaining treatment plans, statistics, options, probabilities. Everything felt unreal. When we got home that night, I collapsed on our couch. Jason wrapped his arms around me. "It's going to be okay." I believed him for a while. The next year became a blur of treatments and hospital visits. Every free moment I had was spent with my father. Jason seemed supportive. At first, he drove me to appointments, visited occasionally, checked on my mother. Everyone praised him. Everyone said how lucky I was to have such a caring husband. I said the same thing, until small things started happening. Things I couldn't explain. One night after a hospital visit, Jason asked a question that caught me completely off guard. "Has your dad updated his will?" I blinked. "What?" The will, I stared. My father is fighting cancer. I know. Then why are you asking about his will? Jason shrugged. I'm just being practical. Practical, that word stuck with me. I didn't answer. A few weeks later, he asked again, then again, then again. Each time I became more uncomfortable, but he always had an excuse. I'm just planning ahead. I'm thinking about our future. We should know what's happening. I wanted to believe him, so I did. Because the alternative was too ugly to consider. Then my father died, and everything changed. The funeral took place on a rainy Thursday morning. Hundreds of people attended, business partners, friends, former employees, neighbors. People whose lives my father had quietly helped over the years. I barely remember most of it. I spent the day in a fog. Grief has a strange way of distorting time. Hours feel like minutes. Minutes feel like hours. Everything becomes blurry, but one moment remains crystal clear. The moment we returned home after the funeral, I was still wearing black. My makeup was ruined from crying. My father had been buried less than 4 hours earlier. Jason sat beside me on the couch and asked the question that changed everything. So when do they read the will? I slowly turned toward him. What? The will? His voice was casual, almost excited. When does that happen? For the first time in our entire marriage, I felt genuinely uncomfortable sitting next to my husband. And deep down, a feeling I couldn't yet explain began forming in my stomach. A feeling that would eventually destroy everything. For the next few days after my father's funeral, I tried convincing myself I had overreacted. People say strange things when they're uncomfortable. People process grief differently. Maybe Jason's question about the will had simply come out wrong. Maybe he was trying to think practically while I was thinking emotionally. That explanation helped me sleep at night. Unfortunately, reality had other plans. 3 days after the funeral, I was sitting in my mother's kitchen helping her sort through sympathy cards. The house felt empty. Every room carried reminders of Dad. His reading glasses sat on the coffee table. His favorite coffee mug was still beside the sink. His gardening hat hung near the back door. It felt impossible that he was gone. Mom was reading a card from one of Dad's former employees when my phone buzzed. Jason, I answered. Hey, are you still at your mom's? Yeah. There was a pause, then he asked it again. Have you heard anything about the estate yet? I closed my eyes, not because I was angry, because I was exhausted. Jason, what? My dad hasn't even been gone a week. I'm aware. Then why are you asking? I'm just curious. Curious, that word again. I looked across the table at my mother. She was quietly wiping tears from her face. Meanwhile, my husband was worried about paperwork. Something felt wrong, deeply wrong. I ended the call shortly afterward, but the uneasiness stayed with me. A week later, the attorney handling my father's estate contacted our family. A meeting had been scheduled. Nothing unusual, just preliminary discussions regarding the estate and trust administration. The moment I told Jason, his reaction surprised me. Actually, surprised isn't the right word. It disturbed me. His entire face lit up, like a child hearing Christmas arrived early. When? Thursday. What time? 10. Can I come? The speed of the question caught me off guard. I stared at him. Why would you come? He immediately laughed. Support. Support. The word sounded hollow. Because over the previous few weeks, support wasn't what I had been feeling from him. Pressure was, questions were, curiosity was, but support, not really. I think it's just family, I said. His expression dropped slightly. Oh, the disappointment was immediate and impossible to miss. Thursday arrived. I drove to the attorney's office with my mother. The entire trip felt surreal. Part of me still expected Dad to call and tell us there had been some mistake. That this wasn't real, that none of this was happening. Instead, we walked into a conference room where 2 attorneys greeted us. What followed wasn't dramatic. There was no giant safe opening, no shocking announcement, no movie-style reading of a will, just paperwork, explanations, legal details, but one particular moment changed everything. One of the attorneys looked at me and smiled. Your father was very thorough. I smiled sadly. That sounds like him, the attorney nodded. He wanted to make absolutely certain his wishes were protected. At the time, I assumed he meant standard estate planning. I had no idea what he really meant. The attorney continued. Most of my father's assets had been transferred into a trust years earlier. The trust contained specific instructions regarding management and distribution. My mother would be financially secure for life. Eventually, remaining assets would transfer to me. Simple enough, or so I thought. The meeting lasted almost 2 hours. When it ended, I returned home emotionally drained. Jason was waiting, literally waiting. The moment I walked through the door, he stood up. How did it go? I set down my purse. It was fine. What happened? I explained the basics. Mom was protected. The properties remained in trust. Everything would continue operating normally. Jason listened carefully, very carefully. Then came the question. So how much? I frowned. How much what? The estate, I stared. What difference does it make? He shrugged. I'm curious. Again, curious, always curious. Never grieving, never concerned about how I was coping, just curious. I finally gave him a rough estimate. The moment the number left my mouth, I watched something happen behind his eyes. Something calculating, something hungry. I can't explain it any other way. His entire demeanor changed, and from that day forward our marriage started feeling different, subtle at first, then impossible to ignore. Over the next month, Jason became obsessed with money. Not his money, not our money, my father's money. Every conversation somehow led back to the estate. Every discussion eventually returned to the trust. Every financial decision became connected to what I might inherit someday. One evening we were discussing replacing our aging car. Jason suddenly laughed. Well, I guess that's not exactly a problem anymore. I looked at him. What does that mean? He smiled. You know. No, I don't. The inheritance. The word made my stomach turn. I noticed he used that word constantly now. Inheritance, estate, assets, trust, property. As if my father had become nothing more than a collection of financial documents. As if the man who taught me how to ride a bike, who attended every graduation, who helped me move into my first apartment, who answered every emergency phone call, had somehow become a balance sheet. The more Jason talked, the more uncomfortable I became. And apparently I wasn't the only one noticing. A few weeks later, my mother invited us to dinner. Halfway through the meal, Jason started asking questions about the commercial properties. Specific questions: revenue, leases, operating expenses, future valuations. I watched my mother's smile slowly disappear. Eventually, she set down her fork. Jason, he looked up. Yeah, why are you so interested in this? The room became silent. For a second, nobody moved. Jason laughed. I like learning. My mother nodded politely. But I could tell she wasn't convinced. Neither was I that night after we got home. I asked him directly. Why do you keep asking about my father's finances? His expression changed instantly. Defensive. What are you talking about? You know exactly what I'm talking about. No, I don't. Every conversation somehow becomes about the estate. He crossed his arms. So now I'm not allowed to ask questions? That's not what I said. Then what are you saying? The argument escalated quickly, much faster than normal, and eventually he said something I will never forget. Your father spent his entire life building wealth. Why is it wrong to talk about it? I stared at him, because that wasn't the issue, not even close. The issue was timing. The issue was obsession. The issue was that my father had barely been buried, and my husband seemed more interested in assets than memories. For the first time in our marriage, I went to bed questioning who I had married. Unfortunately, things were about to get much worse. Because a month later, I accidentally discovered something that completely shattered the image I had of Jason. Something that made every uncomfortable feeling suddenly make sense. And once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. Not ever again. The moment I stopped trusting my husband wasn't when he filed for divorce. It wasn't when he tried claiming part of my father's estate. And it wasn't even when I learned how long he'd been planning everything. It happened months earlier, on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. Because sometimes a marriage doesn't fall apart all at once. Sometimes it shatters one sentence at a time. And one sentence was all it took. It started with a forgotten charger. I had left my phone charger at home that morning and realized it halfway through work. Since I lived only 15 minutes away, I decided to drive home during lunch. I wasn't expected. Jason wasn't supposed to be there either. He normally worked from the office. But when I pulled into the driveway, his car was sitting in the garage. I remember thinking he must have come home early. Maybe he wasn't feeling well. Maybe he was taking a break. I walked inside quietly and immediately heard his voice. At first I wasn't paying attention. Then I heard my name. I stopped. The sound was coming from his home office. The door wasn't completely closed. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop. But once I heard my name, I froze. Jason was laughing, actually laughing. Trust me, he said. A pause, then another laugh. No, it's way more than that. My stomach tightened. I moved closer without thinking. His voice became clearer. Her dad structured everything through properties and investments. Another pause, then the sentence that changed everything. Once the inheritance comes through, neither of us will ever have to worry about money again. Neither of us. The words echoed in my head. Neither of us. Who was us? Because it certainly wasn't me. I stood there completely still. Unable to process what I had just heard, the conversation continued. She's emotional right now. Pause. Yeah, I know. Pause. I just have to be patient. My heart started racing. Patient. Patient for what? I couldn't hear the person on the other end, only Jason, and every sentence made me feel worse. Then he lowered his voice, but not enough. Look, once everything settles down, I'll figure it out. Another pause, then, no. She has no idea. I felt cold, suddenly, instantly, the kind of cold that starts in your stomach and spreads everywhere. I stepped away from the door before he could see me. My mind was racing. Maybe there was an explanation. Maybe I misunderstood. Maybe he was talking to a friend. Maybe no. Even then, I knew better. People don't talk that way about their spouses, not unless something is seriously wrong. I grabbed the charger and left without letting him know I had been home. The entire drive back to work felt unreal. I kept replaying the conversation. Every word, every pause, every laugh. Neither of us. I just have to be patient. She has no idea. The more I thought about it, the worse it became. That evening, I watched Jason carefully. For the first time in our marriage, I wasn't looking at him as my husband. I was looking at him as a stranger. And strangers reveal things when you stop trusting them. He seemed unusually cheerful, relaxed, confident, almost excited. At dinner, he asked another question about the trust, then another, then another. This time, I noticed something new. He wasn't asking emotionally. He was gathering information, like someone building a file, like someone preparing for something. The realization terrified me, because suddenly every strange moment from the previous year started connecting together. The questions, the curiosity, the obsession with the estate, the disappointment whenever information wasn't available. It all pointed in the same direction. And for the first time, a horrible possibility entered my mind. What if my husband wasn't waiting for our future? What if he was waiting for my inheritance? And if that possibility was true, Then what exactly was he planning once he got it? For the next 2 weeks, I didn't confront Jason. Looking back, some people might think that was a mistake. Maybe it was. But when you've spent 7 years building a life with someone, your brain doesn't immediately accept that they're capable of betraying you. You search for other explanations. You look for misunderstandings. You convince yourself there's still a chance you're wrong. That's exactly what I did. I watched. I listened. And unfortunately, the more attention I paid, the worse everything looked. The first thing I noticed was how often Jason disappeared into his home office. That wasn't unusual by itself. His job involved calls and meetings. But now I started noticing patterns. The moment conversations about my father's estate came up, he'd become intensely interested. Then later he'd disappear for an hour, sometimes longer. And whenever I entered the room unexpectedly, he would quickly minimize something on his computer. Again, maybe innocent, maybe not. The problem was that I was running out of reasons to give him the benefit of the doubt. Then one Saturday morning something happened that completely changed how I viewed the situation. We were having breakfast, nothing special. Just coffee and toast. The television was playing quietly in the background. Out of nowhere, Jason asked a question. "What happens if your mother remarries?" I looked up. "What? Your mom? What about her?" He shrugged casually. "What happens to the trust if she gets married again?" I stared at him. Normal people don't ask questions like that, not 6 months after a funeral, not about a grieving widow, not unless they're thinking about money. The moment he realized I was staring, he laughed. "Relax, I'm just curious." There it was again, curious, always curious, never grieving, never sentimental, never focused on family, just finances. The conversation ended quickly. But later that afternoon I found myself thinking about my father. Specifically, something strange he had said about a year before his diagnosis. At the time it seemed random. Now it suddenly felt important. We had been sitting on his back porch watching a baseball game. Jason had stepped inside to answer a phone call. Dad and I were alone. Completely out of nowhere, he asked, "If you ever discover someone isn't who you thought they were, what would you do?" I laughed. "What kind of question is that?" He smiled. "Humor me." I thought for a second. "I guess it depends on what they did." Dad nodded. Then he said something I hadn't thought about in years. "The hardest lies to see are the ones we want to believe." At the time I assumed he was talking about business, or politics, or something he saw on television. Now I wasn't so sure. The memory stayed with me for days, then another memory surfaced, and this one was much harder to ignore. About 2 years before Dad died, he and Jason had gotten into a rare disagreement. Nothing dramatic. Just uncomfortable. We were having dinner when Jason started discussing real estate investments. As usual, he was asking detailed questions about property values and future appreciation. Dad answered politely, until Jason asked something specific. "How much do you think Emily will inherit someday?" The room became quiet. I remember laughing awkwardly. Mom looked uncomfortable. Dad simply set down his fork. Then he looked directly at Jason. "Hopefully enough to never need to worry about it." The answer sounded harmless, but the way he said it wasn't. There was tension underneath it. A warning. Something I didn't understand at the time. Now that memory made my stomach hurt. Because I was starting to suspect my father had seen things long before I did. The question was how much he saw, and whether he had done anything about it. A few days later I got part of that answer, completely by accident. I was helping my mother organize some of Dad's paperwork. The process was emotional. Every folder felt like another reminder he was gone. At one point I found an envelope with my name written on it. Not a letter, just my name. I almost ignored it. Then curiosity got the better of me. Inside was a small note, only 1 paragraph long. It wasn't dated, and it wasn't dramatic, but I still remember every word. "Emily, if you're reading this, there's a good chance I'm no longer around to explain things myself. I trust your judgment. Always have. But remember this, character reveals itself most clearly when money enters the room. Pay attention to actions, not words." That was it. No explanation, no context, nothing else. I sat there staring at the paper, my hands shaking. Because suddenly I wasn't imagining things anymore. My father had seen something. Maybe not everything, but enough to leave me a message, enough to warn me. The realization hit me harder than I expected, not because I was angry, because I was scared. Dad had always been a good judge of people. Far better than I was if he had concerns about Jason. What exactly had he noticed? That night I couldn't sleep. Jason was lying beside me, scrolling through his phone, completely unaware of the storm happening inside my head. For the first time in our marriage, I looked at him and wondered whether I actually knew him at all. Then fate handed me another piece of the puzzle. The very next evening. And this time there was no misunderstanding, no room for doubt, no alternative explanation. Because I finally saw proof that Jason wasn't just talking about the inheritance. He was planning something that involved our marriage, and something that had likely started long before my father died. People always imagine betrayal as one dramatic moment. A lipstick stain, a hotel receipt, a shocking confession. Real life isn't usually that neat. Sometimes betrayal arrives one tiny piece at a time. A strange comment, a suspicious phone call, a feeling you can't explain. Then eventually enough pieces pile up that you can finally see the picture. For me, that picture appeared on a Wednesday night, and once I saw it, there was no going back. It started because Jason forgot to charge his phone. That was it. Nothing dramatic, nothing suspicious. He had fallen asleep on the couch while watching television. His phone was sitting beside him. The battery warning kept flashing. Normally, I would have plugged it in for him, a simple act married people do for each other. But things weren't normal anymore. Not after the conversations, not after Dad's note, not after months of watching my husband obsess over money. As I reached for the phone, a message appeared on the screen. I wasn't trying to snoop, I wasn't even looking. But the notification popped up directly in front of me, and what I saw made my stomach drop. The message read, "Any progress yet?" No name, just a contact number. Then another message arrived immediately afterward. "You said you'd know by now." I froze. A minute later, another message appeared. "You can't keep waiting forever." I stared at the screen. Something felt wrong, very wrong. I wish I could say I immediately unlocked the phone and discovered everything. I didn't. For almost an hour, I sat there arguing with myself, because crossing that line felt huge. Once you invade someone's privacy, you can't undo it. Once you discover something, you can't undiscover it. But eventually one thought won. If my husband was planning something that could destroy my life, I deserved to know. So I unlocked the phone. Jason had never changed his passcode. It was the same one he'd used for years. My birthday, ironically. The first thing I checked was the conversation. The messages weren't romantic, at least not directly. But they were disturbing, extremely disturbing. The contact belonged to a man named Greg, one of Jason's closest friends, someone I had known for years. The conversation stretched back months, and the further I read, the worse it became. At first it looked harmless. General complaints about marriage, work stress, financial frustrations. Then the subject shifted, the estate, my father's estate, again and again, page after page, message after message, Greg asking questions. Jason answering, both of them discussing my inheritance like it was already theirs. One particular exchange made me physically sick. Greg had written, "Dude, if her dad is worth what you think he is, you're set." Jason replied, "Exactly." That one word hit me harder than I expected. Exactly. Not maybe, not hopefully, exactly. As if my father's death had become some kind of financial opportunity. As if my grief was an investment strategy. I kept scrolling, my heart pounding harder with every message. Then I found the conversation that shattered whatever trust remained. Greg, "So what's the plan?" Jason, "I'm waiting until everything settles." Greg, "Then," Jason, "then I make my move." My hand started shaking. Move? What move? I kept reading, and then I found the message, the one that changed everything, the message I would later show my attorney. The message I would read over and over because I couldn't believe someone I loved had written it. Greg had asked, "You really think you'll get half?" Jason responded, "If we're married when the money hits, absolutely." I stopped breathing, literally. For several seconds I couldn't move, couldn't think, couldn't process what I was seeing, because there it was, the truth, written in black and white, not suspicion, not intuition, not paranoia, proof, actual proof. My husband had been thinking about my inheritance for months, maybe years, and apparently he believed he was entitled to it. I should have stopped reading. I didn't. I couldn't. The conversation continued, and every message revealed another piece of the plan. Jason wasn't talking about our future together. He was talking about leverage, timing, strategy, divorce. The word appeared repeatedly, casually, almost professionally, as though our marriage were a business transaction, as though I were a problem to manage. Then I found something even worse. A message sent 3 months before my father died, 3 months before. Greg had written, "What if she never gets anything?" Jason responded, "Trust me, her father has too much money for that." I stared at the screen. My father was still alive when that message was sent, still fighting cancer, still attending treatments, still hoping for more time, and my husband was already discussing the inheritance. The realization broke something inside me. Not anger, not yet, something deeper, something sadder. I had spent months mourning my father. Apparently Jason had spent those same months planning his financial future. The contrast made me feel physically ill. Then came the final blow, a message from only 2 weeks earlier. "Greg, you sure you want to divorce her?" Jason, "Once everything is secure, yes." Greg, "And if she figures it out?" Jason, "She won't." I sat there staring at those words. She won't. The confidence, the certainty, the complete lack of guilt. That was the moment I realized my marriage was already over. Jason just didn't know it yet. I put the phone down and spent most of the night awake. Thinking, remembering, replaying years of conversations, years of moments I had ignored, years of excuses. The most painful part wasn't discovering the messages. It was realizing how long I'd been giving him the benefit of the doubt. The next morning I looked at him differently. Not because I hated him, because I finally saw him clearly, and once that happened, something else became obvious. Jason wasn't waiting for the inheritance anymore. He was getting ready to act. Whatever plan he had been building was nearing the finish line. I could feel it. The problem for Jason was that he wasn't the only person who had been planning ahead. Because while he believed he understood my father's estate, there was one very important detail he didn't know. A detail my father had quietly put into place years earlier. And within a matter of weeks, that secret was going to turn Jason's dream into a nightmare. Looking back, I think Jason believed he was the smartest person in every room. That was his biggest weakness, not his greed, not his selfishness. His arrogance, because arrogance makes people careless, and careless people eventually reveal themselves. After discovering those messages, I stopped confronting him. I stopped arguing, stopped questioning, stopped reacting. Instead, I observed. And the less resistance I gave him, the more comfortable he became. The more comfortable he became, the more his mask slipped. Within a few weeks, he barely even tried hiding his obsession anymore. One evening he came home carrying brochures for luxury homes, not houses we could afford, not houses that matched our current income. Mansions, waterfront properties, places with private docks and six-car garages. He spread them across the kitchen table like a child showing off new toys. Look at this one. I stared at him. Why? What do you mean why? We're not buying a house. Not right now, he smiled, that smile. The one I had started noticing more and more, the smile of someone imagining money that wasn't theirs. Eventually. Another word that had become part of his vocabulary. Eventually, soon, when everything settles. After the estate, every sentence pointed toward the same thing. A future he believed was coming. A future funded by my father's death. The conversation ended quickly, but something important happened afterward. For the first time, I didn't feel confused. I didn't feel uncertain. I felt angry, not explosive anger, not screaming anger, cold anger, the kind that comes when denial finally disappears. Because once the truth becomes impossible to ignore, anger replaces confusion. And I was finally seeing the truth. A few days later, I made a decision that would change everything. I called an attorney, not a divorce attorney. Not yet an estate attorney. I wanted answers, real answers, specifically about my father's trust. The meeting took place the following week. I didn't tell Jason. I simply took a personal day from work and drove to the attorney's office. The same office that had handled Dad's estate. The same office where Jason had desperately wanted to attend meetings. As I sat across from the attorney, I felt strangely nervous, almost guilty, which was ridiculous considering what I had discovered. The attorney greeted me warmly, then asked a simple question. What can I help you with? I hesitated, then told him everything, not every detail, just enough. The inheritance questions, the strange behavior, the messages, the discussions about divorce. By the time I finished speaking, his expression had changed, not surprised, almost like he had expected something similar. That immediately caught my attention. The attorney leaned back, then asked something unexpected. Did your father ever discuss concerns about your husband? My heart skipped. No, the attorney nodded slowly. I see. The response felt deliberate. Careful, measured, like someone choosing words very carefully. What does that mean? I asked. He folded his hands. Your father was an extremely thoughtful man. I waited. He planned extensively, still waiting. And he was very protective of you. The room felt silent. I could sense there was more, much more. Finally, I asked directly. Did my father think Jason was after money? The attorney didn't answer immediately. Instead, he opened a folder, flipped through several pages, then looked up. I can't speak for what your father thought. That wasn't a denial, not even close. Then he continued. What I can say is that your father specifically instructed us to ensure trust assets remain protected from future marital disputes. I stared at him. What does that mean? The attorney smiled slightly. It means he wanted the assets insulated from divorce proceedings. My pulse quickened. Insulated how? The attorney paused, then said the sentence that changed everything. Your father designed the trust so that any future spouse would have extraordinarily limited access to the assets. I felt like someone had knocked the air from my lungs. For a second I couldn't speak, because suddenly all those memories came rushing back. The comments, the warnings, the note. Character reveals itself when money enters the room. Pay attention to actions, not words. Dad had known something, maybe not everything, but enough. Enough to prepare, enough to protect me, enough to anticipate a problem before it happened. Tears immediately filled my eyes. The attorney handed me a tissue. I laughed awkwardly while wiping them away. I'm sorry. No need, I nodded. Because in that moment I wasn't crying from sadness. I was crying because my father was still protecting me, even after he was gone. The attorney continued explaining. The trust structure was complex, very complex. Most assets remained inside protected entities. Ownership wasn't transferred directly. Distributions followed specific rules. There were layers of legal separation designed specifically to prevent opportunistic claims. I didn't understand every detail, but I understood enough. Jason's assumptions were wrong, dangerously wrong. The more the attorney explained, the clearer it became. The fortune Jason thought he could access wasn't actually accessible. Not the way he imagined, not even close. By the time the meeting ended, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Relief. For the first time since Dad died, I knew I wasn't helpless. Jason had a plan, but my father had a better one. Unfortunately, I still wasn't prepared for what happened next. Because 2 weeks later, Jason stopped pretending entirely. No more subtle hints, no more careful questions, no more waiting. He walked through our front door one Friday evening carrying a manila envelope, set it on the kitchen counter, and calmly informed me that our marriage was over. The envelope contained divorce papers, but that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the smile on his face when he handed them to me. A smile that said he believed he had already won. A smile that was about to cost him everything. I always imagined that if my marriage ended, it would be emotional. Tears, arguments, heartbreak, some kind of painful conversation where two people acknowledged things weren't working anymore. What I never imagined was watching my husband serve me divorce papers with the confidence of someone cashing a winning lottery ticket. But that's exactly what happened. It was a Friday evening. I had just returned home from work. Jason was already there, sitting at the kitchen table, waiting. The moment I walked inside, I knew something was different. There was a strange energy in the room, a calmness that didn't feel natural. He wasn't watching television, wasn't looking at his phone. He was simply sitting there, waiting for me. The manila envelope sat on the table between us. I looked at it, then at him. "What is that?" Jason smiled, not warmly, not sadly, just confidently. "Something we need to discuss." My stomach tightened. I already knew, maybe not consciously, but somewhere deep down I knew. I sat down. Jason slid the envelope toward me. I opened it. Divorce papers, just like that. 7 years of marriage reduced to a stack of legal documents. I stared at them for several seconds, then looked back at him. Jason seemed almost relieved, like he'd finally completed a task he'd been putting off. "I'm filing for divorce," he said. I remember feeling strangely calm, not because it didn't hurt, because I had been expecting it. The messages, the planning, the conversations with Greg. Part of me had already accepted this moment was coming. Still, hearing it out loud hurt, a lot. "Why?" I asked. The question sounded stupid the moment it left my mouth. Because I already knew the answer, but I wanted to hear him say it. Jason leaned back in his chair. "I think we've grown apart." There it was, the generic excuse, the one people use when they don't want to tell the truth. "We've grown apart?" "Yes," I nodded slowly. "Interesting." His expression changed slightly. "What does that mean?" "It means your timing is remarkable." For the first time, I saw uncertainty flash across his face, only for a second. Then it disappeared. "I don't know what you're implying." I almost laughed. The audacity was incredible. Months of planning, months of discussing my inheritance, months of preparing his exit. And now he wanted to pretend this was about growing apart. I looked directly at him. "How long have you been planning this?" The question caught him off guard. "I haven't." That lie came too quickly, too smoothly, too practiced. I realized then that Jason had rehearsed this conversation. He expected tears, shock, begging. What he didn't expect was someone who already knew. Unfortunately for him, I knew far more than he realized. For several minutes we exchanged meaningless conversation. Generic explanations, carefully crafted excuses. Neither of us believed any of it. Then finally Jason made a mistake. A big one. He got comfortable. Comfortable people become honest. And Jason was feeling very comfortable. Maybe because he thought he'd won, maybe because he thought I was clueless. Either way, his mask slipped. The conversation shifted toward finances. Naturally, everything always shifted toward finances with Jason. Then he said something interesting. "We both deserve a fair division." I looked at him. "Fair division of what?" "Our marital assets." His tone was casual, but I could hear the real meaning underneath. The estate, the inheritance, my father's money. I decided to push a little. "And what exactly do you think that includes?" Jason shrugged. "Whatever the attorneys determine." There was a confidence in his voice that fascinated me. A certainty, the certainty of someone expecting a large payout. Then he smiled. Actually smiled. And that's when I realized something important. Jason genuinely believed he was about to become wealthy, not hopeful, not optimistic, certain. The realization was almost surreal, because I knew something he didn't. I knew about the trust, I knew about the protections, I knew about my father's planning. Meanwhile, Jason was sitting across from me imagining millions. The contrast was almost comical. Almost. But I wasn't laughing yet. Because I still didn't know how much damage he intended to cause. The following week answered that question. I hired a divorce attorney, a very good one. And during our first meeting, I brought copies of everything. The messages, the conversations, the screenshots, every piece of evidence I had collected. My attorney reviewed everything carefully, then looked up. "Your husband appears to have made a serious assumption." I nodded. "About the inheritance?" "Exactly." I couldn't help smiling, a small smile, the first genuine smile I'd had in months. My attorney continued. "Based on the trust documents, his position is extremely weak." Extremely weak. I liked those words, very much. But things got even better. Because a few days later, Jason's attorney requested preliminary financial disclosures. The request made perfect sense. Standard procedure, except for one thing. The list of assets they were requesting revealed exactly what Jason thought he was entitled to. And the number was enormous. Absolutely enormous. The moment my attorney saw it, she actually laughed. Not unprofessionally. Just genuinely surprised. "He really thinks he can access all of this?" Apparently he did. Every property, every investment, every trust-held asset, everything. It was like watching someone walk into a bank and casually request ownership of the building. The confidence was unbelievable. My attorney shook her head. "He's going to be very disappointed." At that moment, I thought disappointment would be the worst outcome for Jason. I was wrong, because disappointment implies someone made a mistake. What Jason had done was much worse. And over the next several weeks, we would discover exactly how long he had been planning this. How many people knew, how much he had hidden, and most importantly, who he had been spending time with while waiting for my father's estate. Because as ugly as the inheritance scheme was, it wasn't the only secret Jason had been keeping. Not even close. And when that secret finally surfaced, it destroyed whatever sympathy anyone might have had for him, including the judge. If Jason had simply filed for divorce and walked away, things would have been painful, but manageable. Unfortunately, greed rarely stops when it should. Instead of accepting reality, Jason doubled down, then tripled down, and eventually walked straight into a disaster of his own making. The first major divorce conference took place about 2 months after he filed. Both attorneys were present. Financial disclosures had been exchanged. Asset documentation had been reviewed. And for the first time, everyone would discuss the trust in detail. I wasn't nervous. Not really. By that point, I already understood what my father had done. The trust had existed for years, long before Dad became sick, long before divorce was ever discussed, long before Jason even realized there might be money involved. Dad hadn't built it to punish anyone, he built it to protect his family. The difference mattered. Jason, however, appeared extremely confident, almost cheerful, as if he expected the meeting to confirm everything he'd been imagining. The moment he walked into the conference room, I noticed something strange. He barely looked at me. Instead, he immediately started speaking with his attorney, whispering, pointing at documents, acting like a businessman preparing for a major acquisition. It would have been funny if it weren't so pathetic. The meeting began. For the first 20 minutes, everything remained routine. Procedures, schedules, deadlines, standard legal discussions. Then the trust became the topic, and that's when everything changed. One of the attorneys opened a folder, adjusted his glasses, and calmly began explaining the structure. The explanation wasn't dramatic. No one raised their voice. No shocking reveal, just facts. Cold, boring legal facts. The trust owned the assets, not me. The properties remained under trust control. The investments remained under trust control. The distributions followed trust instructions. The entities holding those assets were separate from marital property. Every sentence seemed to remove another piece of the fortune Jason believed he was getting. At first, he didn't react. I don't think he understood. Then his attorney interrupted. "Can you clarify something?" The attorney handling the trust nodded. "Of course. Are you saying the assets themselves are not subject to division?" "Correct." Silence. Jason finally looked up, his confidence visibly slipping. His attorney continued. "What portion would potentially be considered marital?" The response came immediately. "Based on our review, very little. Very little." I watched Jason blink, then blink again, like his brain was struggling to process the answer. The trust attorney continued explaining. Years of planning, years of legal protections, years of separation between trust assets and marital property. Every explanation made the same point. The money Jason wanted wasn't available. Not to him, not through divorce, not through settlement negotiations, not through legal pressure, not through anything. His dream was evaporating in real time, and he could do absolutely nothing about it. The best part? The trust had been established years before, meaning there was no argument that it had been created to avoid divorce claims. My father had built it long before anyone could accuse him of planning around Jason, which made the protections incredibly strong. Jason finally spoke, his voice noticeably tighter than before. "There has to be some value attributable to future distributions." The attorney remained calm. "There are distributions." Jason leaned forward. "Exactly," the attorney nodded, "which are governed by trust terms." Then came the sentence that effectively ended the discussion. "And those terms do not provide ownership rights to spouses." Silence. Complete silence. I looked at Jason, the man who had spent months imagining himself wealthy. The man who filed for divorce believing he had discovered a shortcut to millions. The man who thought he had outsmarted everyone. His face had gone pale. For a brief moment, I actually saw panic. Real panic. The kind people experience when they suddenly realize their assumptions were wrong. Very wrong. The meeting ended shortly afterward. Outside the conference room, Jason tried speaking to his attorney. The attorney's expression told me everything. There was no secret strategy, no hidden loophole, no miracle solution. Reality had arrived. And reality wasn't on Jason's side. But that wasn't the end of his problems, not even close, because during the financial review process, another issue had surfaced, one that initially seemed unrelated. Several unusual expenses had appeared in Jason's records, small at first, then increasingly difficult to explain. Restaurant bills, weekend trips, hotel charges, gift purchases, none of which I recognized. At first I assumed there must be an innocent explanation. Business travel, client meetings, something like that. Then my attorney started asking questions. Questions Jason struggled to answer. Very simple questions. Where were you? Who were you with? Why wasn't your wife present? Why did these charges occur repeatedly? The answers became increasingly inconsistent, and inconsistencies tend to attract attention. The deeper everyone looked, the more suspicious things became. Then came the discovery that changed the entire divorce. A private investigator hired during the proceedings uncovered evidence that Jason had been seeing someone else. Not recently, not after filing, before, long before. Months before my father died. Months before the inheritance discussions. Months before the divorce papers. The relationship had been happening while he was still pretending to be a devoted husband, while sitting beside me in hospital waiting rooms, while attending family dinners, while comforting me during the hardest year of my life. The betrayal hit differently than the inheritance scheme. The money made me angry. The affair made me sad because suddenly everything became clear. Jason hadn't been planning a future with me. He'd been planning an exit, a carefully timed exit, one designed to maximize what he could take on the way out. The inheritance wasn't the entire plan. It was just the biggest piece, and now that piece was gone. The problem for Jason was that once investigators started uncovering one lie, they started finding others. And the next discovery would be far worse, because it would reveal that his affair partner knew about the inheritance too. In fact, she had been helping him plan. If Jason had simply been greedy, I could have understood it, not forgiven it, not accepted it, but understood it. People do selfish things when money is involved. What I struggled to understand was the cruelty, the planning, the fact that he had looked me in the eye every day while building an escape plan behind my back. That was the part that kept me awake at night. The part that hurt more than the divorce itself. Because by this point, the marriage was already dead. What remained was figuring out how long it had been dead. And unfortunately, the answer was longer than I ever imagined. About 3 weeks after the conference where Jason learned he wasn't getting the inheritance, my attorney called me. Her voice sounded unusually serious. "Do you have a minute?" Immediately, my stomach dropped. "Sure. I think we've identified the woman." For a moment, I didn't respond, even though I knew there had been an affair. Even though I knew evidence existed. Hearing those words still felt different, real, permanent, painful. "Who is she?" My attorney gave me a name, and when she did, I nearly dropped the phone because I knew exactly who she was. Not a stranger, not some random woman, not someone Jason met recently. She had attended our wedding. She had sat at our dinner table. She had hugged me after my father's funeral. Her name was Melissa. And for years, I considered her a friend. The betrayal hit me so hard I had to sit down. I honestly think that moment hurt more than discovering the affair itself. Because strangers don't earn your trust first. Friends do. Apparently, Melissa had been earning mine while helping Jason destroy it. The investigation continued, and every new discovery felt worse than the last. The relationship wasn't recent. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a brief lapse in judgment. It had been ongoing for nearly 2 years. 2 years, almost a third of my marriage, while I was visiting hospitals, while I was helping my father through treatment, while I was grieving. Jason had been building another relationship. The more evidence surfaced, the uglier the picture became. Then came the messages, hundreds of them, some romantic, some inappropriate, some simply disgusting. But one category stood out above everything else. The inheritance discussions. Because Melissa knew, she knew exactly what Jason was expecting, exactly what he was planning, exactly why he was waiting. One message in particular made me physically sick. Melissa had written, "So when are you finally leaving her?" Jason responded, "After everything settles with the estate. Not after our marriage improved, not after counseling failed, not after some emotional realization, after the estate." Those 3 words confirmed everything. The inheritance wasn't a factor, it was the plan, the entire plan. Another exchange was even worse. "Melissa, what if she gets suspicious?" Jason, "She won't, she's too focused on her family right now." I remember reading that sentence 3 times, not because I misunderstood it, because I couldn't believe someone could be that cold. My father was dying. And Jason saw that as an opportunity, an advantage, a distraction, something he could use. The more I learned, the more horrifying the timeline became. While I was sitting in hospital waiting rooms, Jason was texting Melissa. While I was comforting my mother, Jason was discussing future plans. While I was mourning my father, Jason was calculating potential payouts. And perhaps the worst part? Melissa wasn't discouraging him, she was encouraging him. Actively, repeatedly. In one conversation, she joked about retirement. Retirement. From money that didn't belong to either of them. Money generated by a man they weren't even respecting in death. The messages painted a picture neither of them intended anyone to see. Not a love story. Not 2 people who accidentally fell for each other. 2 opportunists convincing each other they deserved something they had never earned. The deeper the attorneys dug, the more desperate Jason became. His confidence disappeared almost overnight. The man who had filed for divorce with a smile now looked exhausted, nervous, irritable. Every legal setback seemed to hit harder than the last, and they kept coming. Because once credibility starts disappearing in court, it rarely comes back. The affair damaged him. The inheritance scheme damaged him. The messages damaged him. But the biggest problem was consistency, or rather, the lack of it. Jason had spent months claiming the divorce was about growing apart, about compatibility, about personal growth. Now there was evidence showing he had been planning the separation while carrying on a long-term affair and discussing my inheritance. The explanations didn't match the facts. Judges notice things like that. Attorneys definitely notice things like that. And eventually, Jason realized something terrifying. The divorce he thought would make him rich was becoming a public record of his greed. A record supported by his own messages, his own actions, his own words. Nobody had forced him to write those messages. Nobody had forced him to make those plans. He had done it all himself. The consequences were simply arriving. Then came the final blow, the one neither Jason nor Melissa saw coming. Because while everyone was busy uncovering their scheme, another document surfaced. A document created by my father years earlier. A document that revealed just how much he had actually understood. And when that document was read aloud, the room went completely silent, including Jason. Because in that moment, he realized my father had seen through him long before anyone else did. The strange thing about grief is that sometimes the people we lose continue protecting us long after they're gone. For months after my father's death, I had been discovering pieces of him everywhere. Old photographs, handwritten notes, business records, birthday cards, tiny reminders that he had existed, tiny reminders that he was loved, but nothing prepared me for the final thing he left behind. Because unlike the notes I had already found, this one wasn't meant to comfort me. It was meant to reveal the truth, and when it finally surfaced, it changed everything. The discovery happened almost by accident. One of the attorneys handling the trust was reviewing archived estate documents. Most of it was routine. Legal correspondence, administrative records, planning documents. Then they found a sealed memorandum attached to one of the trust revisions. The document wasn't legally necessary. It wasn't part of the trust instructions. It was more of an explanation. a personal statement from my father regarding why certain protections had been added. When my attorney called to tell me about it, I assumed it would contain generic estate planning language, something boring, something technical. I couldn't have been more wrong. A few days later, everyone gathered for another legal meeting. Attorneys, financial advisors, Jason, me. The atmosphere felt tense. By that point, the case had already turned ugly. Jason knew the inheritance was out of reach. The affair had been exposed. The messages had surfaced. Every week seemed to bring another setback for him, and yet somehow things were still about to get worse. The trust attorney opened the file, adjusted his glasses, and began reading. The first portion sounded exactly as expected. My father discussed protecting family assets, maintaining financial stability, ensuring future generations would benefit from what he had built. Nothing unusual. Then the wording changed. The attorney paused briefly before continuing. Over the years, I have learned that wealth attracts two types of people. The room became quieter. Those who respect the work required to create it. Another pause. And those who believe they deserve it simply because they stand near it. I felt chills run down my arms, because that sounded exactly like my father. Direct, simple, honest. The attorney continued reading. I do not build these protections because I distrust my daughter. My eyes immediately filled with tears. I build them because I trust her. The room remained completely silent. She has always led with her heart. That is one of her greatest strengths. It can also make her vulnerable to people who lead with something else. I swallowed hard. Across the room, Jason stared at the table, not moving, not speaking, just staring. The attorney continued. If these protections ever become necessary, then they have served their purpose. Another pause. And if they are never needed, then I will be grateful for having worried unnecessarily. At that point, nobody in the room was looking at paperwork anymore. Everyone was listening, because this wasn't really about legal planning. It was about a father trying to protect his daughter, even from things he couldn't fully predict. Then came the line that changed everything. Character is revealed when opportunity appears. The attorney stopped briefly, then finished the paragraph. The people worth trusting are the ones who remain the same after seeing the opportunity. The silence afterward felt endless. I looked down at the table because I could no longer hold back tears. Not sad tears, not entirely. Part grief, part gratitude, part disbelief that my father still somehow knew exactly what I needed to hear. Then I looked across the room. Jason had gone completely pale. For the first time since the divorce began, he looked genuinely shaken, not angry, not frustrated, shaken. Because whether my father had been referring specifically to him or not, the message fit perfectly. Too perfectly. And everyone in that room knew it, including Jason. The meeting ended shortly afterward, but the effects lingered for days. For weeks, because from that point forward, the narrative of the divorce changed. Before, it had been a financial dispute. Now it felt like something else. A story. One that looked increasingly terrible for Jason. The husband who waited for an inheritance. The husband who discussed future payouts. The husband who planned a divorce while carrying on an affair. The husband who thought he'd found a shortcut to wealth. The facts weren't helping him. Neither was public perception. And unfortunately for him, consequences were still arriving. Because while the trust had already destroyed his financial expectations, the final settlement negotiations were about to destroy something else. His ego, completely. The man who entered this process expecting millions was about to discover exactly what he was walking away with. And when those numbers were finally presented, even his own attorney struggled to hide their disappointment. By the time settlement negotiations began, Jason no longer looked like the man who had handed me divorce papers. That confident smile was gone. The swagger was gone. Even the certainty was gone. In its place was something else. Stress. The kind of stress that comes when reality refuses to cooperate with your plans. For months, Jason had operated under one assumption, that my father's death would eventually make him wealthy. Everything he did flowed from that belief. The affair, the timing, the divorce, the financial demands, the calculations, every decision pointed back to the same expectation, and now that expectation had collapsed, completely. The settlement conference took place on a rainy Tuesday morning. I remember because the weather matched the mood perfectly. Gray, cold, heavy. Everyone looked tired. The attorneys, the accountants, the advisors, even Jason. Months of legal battles had drained everyone. The difference was that most people were tired from working. Jason looked tired from losing. The negotiations themselves weren't particularly dramatic. Most divorces aren't. There are no dramatic speeches. No surprise witnesses bursting through doors. Just paperwork, numbers, discussions, compromises, reality. And reality wasn't being kind to Jason. When the final asset calculations were presented, his reaction was impossible to miss. The marital assets existed. Of course they did. Our home equity, retirement accounts accumulated during marriage, joint savings, standard things, the kind of assets people normally divide during divorce. But compared to what Jason had imagined, they were microscopic. At one point, his attorney reviewed the figures and quietly explained them. I watched Jason's expression change in stages: confusion, disbelief, frustration. Then something very close to panic, because he finally understood. There wasn't going to be a miracle. There wasn't going to be a loophole. There wasn't going to be a massive payout. The fortune he'd spent months imagining had never belonged to him. And never would. The settlement discussions continued for several hours. At one point, Jason actually asked whether future trust distributions could still be considered. The answer was the same as before. No, firmly, unequivocally. No. His attorney didn't even argue. By then everyone knew the issue was dead. The trust wasn't moving, the protections weren't disappearing, and my father's planning wasn't being undone. For the first time since the divorce started, I felt something unexpected. Peace. Not happiness, not satisfaction, peace. Because the uncertainty was finally ending, the waiting was finally ending, the constant legal battles were finally ending. And most importantly, Jason's ability to control the narrative was ending. Then something interesting happened. The affair became public. Not national news, not internet-famous public, but public enough. Friends learned. Family learned. Former coworkers learned. Mutual acquaintances learned. And suddenly Jason had a new problem. People were talking, not because he got divorced. Divorce happens every day. People were talking because of the timing, because of the messages, because of the inheritance discussions, because the story looked terrible. And unfortunately for him, the story happened to be true. Several mutual friends stopped speaking to him entirely. Others distanced themselves quietly. A few attempted to defend him initially, then they saw the evidence. After that, most of those defenses disappeared. The hardest fallout came from his own family, particularly his older sister, a woman I had always respected. One afternoon she called me unexpectedly. I almost didn't answer, but I did. The first thing she said was, "I'm sorry." Just that. 2 words, nothing more, nothing less. For several seconds neither of us spoke. Then she continued. I didn't know. I believed her. Because unlike Jason, she sounded devastated. Not defensive, not manipulative, genuinely devastated. Apparently she had recently seen some of the messages, the inheritance discussions, the affair timeline, the planning, and she was horrified. I don't recognize the person I'm seeing in those messages, she said. Neither did I, or maybe that wasn't true. Maybe I finally did recognize him. That was the painful part. The person in those messages wasn't a stranger. It was the real Jason. The version hidden underneath years of charm and excuses. The version my father apparently noticed long before I did. As the settlement approached its conclusion, the consequences kept growing. Melissa's life wasn't exactly improving either. The fantasy she and Jason had built together had depended on one thing: money. A lot of money. The future they imagined wasn't based on love. It was based on access. Access they no longer had. Once that disappeared, cracks began forming almost immediately, at least according to people who knew them. Arguments became frequent. Tension increased. The excitement vanished, which wasn't surprising. It's easy to dream together when you're expecting millions. It's much harder when reality arrives. And reality had arrived in spectacular fashion. Then came the final settlement meeting. The last major step before everything became official. The last opportunity for Jason to somehow salvage something, anything, but there was nothing left to salvage. The numbers were final. The agreement was final. The outcome was final. And as everyone prepared to sign the documents, I looked across the room at the man I once believed I would grow old with. He looked smaller somehow, not physically, emotionally, like someone who had spent so much time chasing something that he forgot to value what he already had. A marriage, a family, a future, all traded away for a fantasy, and now the fantasy was gone. The only thing remaining was the bill. The final chapter of the story would arrive a few weeks later, when the divorce officially closed, when Jason discovered exactly how empty his victory really was, and when I finally understood something my father had spent years trying to teach me. The most expensive mistakes in life aren't always financial. Sometimes they're the people you choose to become. 3 weeks after the final settlement meeting, my divorce became official. No dramatic courtroom showdown. No last-minute surprises. Just a judge's signature, a few documents, and the quiet ending of a marriage I once thought would last forever. It's strange how something that consumes years of your life can end in a matter of minutes. I walked out of the courthouse feeling lighter than I had in over a year. Not happy, not yet. Healing isn't that simple, but lighter, like someone had finally removed a weight I didn't realize I was carrying. For the first time since my father's diagnosis, I could breathe, really breathe. The legal battle was over, the uncertainty was over, and Jason's plan was over, completely. A few days later, I learned something that perfectly summarized the entire situation. Jason and Melissa had broken up. At first, I didn't believe it. The timing seemed almost ridiculous. After everything they had done, after everything they had planned, after everything they had risked, surely they would at least stay together. Apparently not. According to mutual friends, the relationship began falling apart almost immediately after the trust issue became impossible to overcome. Arguments became constant. Resentment grew. Accusations followed. Eventually, the entire thing collapsed. When I first heard the news, I laughed. Not because I was celebrating someone else's pain, because it was so predictable. The relationship had been built on a fantasy, and fantasies rarely survive reality, especially when money is involved. The future they imagined never existed. The millions never arrived. The easy life never appeared. The shortcut never worked. And once those dreams disappeared, they were left facing each other without the thing that originally connected them. Greed isn't a strong foundation for a relationship. Turns out it's not a foundation at all. A month later, I ran into Jason unexpectedly. It happened at a grocery store. Of all places, no lawyers, no courtrooms, no paperwork. Just 2 people pushing shopping carts beneath fluorescent lights. For a moment, neither of us spoke. It was the first time I'd seen him since the divorce finalized. He looked older, not dramatically older, just tired. The kind of tired that comes from carrying regret, or maybe disappointment, perhaps both. We exchanged a brief hello, awkward, polite, nothing more. Then something happened that surprised me. Jason apologized, not completely. Not perfectly, but genuinely enough that I believed he meant it. He looked down at the floor, then back at me. I made a lot of mistakes. I nodded, neither agreeing nor disagreeing, because there wasn't really anything left to discuss. The evidence had already spoken. The choices had already been made. The consequences had already arrived. After a few seconds, he said something I'll never forget. I thought I knew what would make me happy. For the first time in a very long time, I felt sorry for him. Not enough to excuse what he did, not enough to forget, but enough to understand something important. Jason had spent years chasing money, then sacrificed a marriage trying to get more of it, and in the end he lost both. That isn't a victory, that's a tragedy, one entirely of his own making. We spoke for less than 2 minutes. Then we went our separate ways, and that was the last time I saw him. Oddly enough, I don't remember feeling angry afterward. The anger had disappeared months earlier. What remained was acceptance. Acceptance that some people reveal who they are eventually. Acceptance that not every relationship can be saved. Acceptance that my father's warnings had been right all along. A few months later, my mother and I visited Dad's grave, something we did often. We brought fresh flowers, cleaned the headstone, talked about life. The same things families do when they're missing someone. Before leaving, I sat quietly for a few minutes, thinking, remembering, reflecting, and suddenly I found myself laughing. My mother looked over. What? I smiled. Dad won? She laughed too, because she understood immediately. He hadn't won a legal battle. He hadn't defeated anyone. That wasn't who he was. What he won was peace of mind. The peace of knowing he protected the people he loved. The peace of knowing his life's work wouldn't be exploited. The peace of knowing that character eventually reveals itself, exactly as he predicted. Before we left, I thought about the note he had written, the one I found months earlier. Character reveals itself most clearly when money enters the room. At the time, those words felt like a warning. Now they felt like wisdom. Because money hadn't changed Jason. Money revealed Jason. That's an important difference. The greed was already there. The entitlement was already there. The opportunity simply exposed it. And in a strange way, I'm grateful it happened. Not for the pain, not for the betrayal, not for the divorce, but for the clarity. Imagine spending another 10 years with someone like that. Another 20. Imagine discovering the truth even later. Instead, I found out while I still had time to rebuild. And rebuild I did. Over the next year, life slowly improved. I focused on work, spent more time with family, traveled, made new friends, started creating a future that actually belonged to me. Not one dependent on someone else's expectations. Not one built around someone else's greed. Mine. For the first time in years, I felt free. And every now and then when people ask what happened between Jason and me, I give them the shortest possible version. My husband thought my father's death would make him rich. That's usually enough, because everything else is just details. The affair, the divorce, the trust, the legal battle, all details. The real story is much simpler. A man saw an opportunity. A father saw the man. And years before anyone else understood why, my father made sure his daughter would be protected, even after he was gone. And that is why the day my husband filed for divorce expecting half my inheritance was actually the day he lost everything.